It's now been confirmed in both Moscow and Washington that the virtual summit meeting between President Putin of Russia and President Biden of the United States is going to take place on Tuesday next week. Now, it's absolutely obvious to me that this meeting has been brought forward. The original intention, if one goes back and recalls the various statements that would be made by the various officials, is that the meeting would take place around the new year. But the overheated rhetoric in the West about this Russian invasion of Ukraine, based on troop deployments, some of which some people are becoming increasingly skeptical about, all this overheated rhetoric has caused the US to agree, or perhaps more plausibly to propose, that this meeting take place on Tuesday, in other words, several weeks before the new year. That essentially confirms that the topics to be discussed over the course of this meeting are going to be extremely limited. In fact, we can say precisely what those topics of discussion are going to be. They're going to be the situation in Ukraine and the general situation in Europe. Now, what is going to happen? Straightforwardly, what I'm sure is going to happen is that President Biden is going to tell President Putin of Russia that the United States will impose sanctions on Russia and perhaps take other steps against Russia in the event that there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. A Russian invasion of Ukraine, which of course Russia is insistently denying that it is planning. The Russians have, for their part, made it quite clear that in the event of a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass, on the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, they would react with full force. And there's no doubt at all that in that event, the Ukrainian offensive would be comprehensively defeated. And indeed, it's difficult to imagine that the Ukrainian military would survive in any functional form. So one would assume that, given that the United States says that it does not want to see a Russian attack on Ukraine, and given that the Russians say that they have no plan to attack Ukraine unless Ukraine attacks the two republics of the Donbass, the situation should not be complicated or difficult to resolve. The United States could simply tell the Ukrainians, under no circumstances, launch an attack on the two republics of the Donbass. Were that to happen, the entire crisis that we've seen working its way up over the last few weeks would in effect go away. I'm going to say straight away that I think behind the scenes, that is precisely what has been happening. It's been actually striking to see how US officials, even as they make all kinds of claims of Russian aggression against Ukraine, even as they threaten Russia with all sorts of unspecified measures, but measures which essentially boil down to economic sanctions, are at the same time coupling all these threats with advice to Ukraine to exercise restraint. In other words, not to launch an attack in eastern Ukraine. And I am sure that is because, despite claims that some people are making that the United States and the Western powers do want to see a war in eastern Ukraine, at least in February, and believe that they can deter the Russians with threats of economic sanctions from responding to a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass, which some people think may happen in late January or early February. I think the reality is that the United States government, or at least the more sane parts of it, emphatically do not want a war in eastern Ukraine. Now, let's try and unpack the reasons why that would be so. Firstly, there would be obviously an attack, a counterattack by the Russians in the event that there were such an offensive by the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. An offensive by the Ukrainian army, which, as I recently discussed in a program which I've recently done for this program, for this channel, the Ukrainian army seems, on the basis of reporting by the London Times, to be in no condition anyway to carry out. The London Times described an army demoralised and bogged down in trench warfare along the contact line between itself, between Ukraine and the militias of the Donbass, and with comments from Ukrainian soldiers openly admitting to the reporters of the London Times that Ukraine is in no position to win such a war. So I can't imagine that it makes much military sense for the United States to egg on Ukraine to launch an offensive in eastern Ukraine, which the Ukrainians would unquestionably lose and which would result in the Ukrainian military being defeated and quite probably Ukraine as it exists today being completely destroyed, at least as a political entity or a state. So there doesn't seem to be much military logic here. There doesn't seem to me to be much political logic either, because if such a thing were to happen, if Ukraine were indeed to be comprehensively defeated in eastern Ukraine, if the Russian military were to do what many people believe, myself included, by the way, which is expand the areas of control of the militias beyond the current borders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics to include the entire Donbass region, in other words, the Lugansk and Donetsk oblasts, and beyond that, most probably all the territories that make up the former territory of the Tsarist Empire known as Novorossiya, which include places like Kharkiv in northeast Ukraine, and Odessa, and Nikolaev, and Kherson, and Zaporozhye in southeast Ukraine. Well, were that to happen, it would be a cataclysmic political disaster for the United States. It's difficult to see, to my mind, how the Biden administration could survive such a debacle, and beyond that, the rump Ukrainian state, which would be left, would be incredibly exposed, with the Russian military located only a few 100 kilometers from the capital, Kiev itself, and with Ukraine cut off from access to the sea. I have to say that that is a nightmare scenario for Ukraine, and I would have thought for the United States government, which would find itself having to explain to the political class in Washington why shortly after the debacle in Afghanistan, it has had to experience a far bigger and greater debacle all over again. And I would add that it would also be a disaster for Europe. The Europeans would have been exposed as the empty and the paper tiger that they are. And the Ukrainian defense minister is in fact already talking today about how in that event there would be millions of refugees heading westward from Ukraine, perfectly possible. And there would, of course, be interruptions of energy and food supplies from Russia and to some extent from Ukraine also. So to be straightforward about that, those are not very substantial. There would be interruptions of food supplies heading westward, also intensifying the economic crisis in Europe. Now, if that were not bad enough, we now come to the problem of the economic crisis, which is, of course, what the Ukrainian defense minister is in effect talking about. Now, here I'm going to say something briefly about the sanctions. We've heard reports from the United States about how the sanctions, new sanctions, would be imposed on Russia and how devastating those sanctions would be, and how they would be sanctions of a sort that Russia has never experienced before. The Russians are completely unimpressed and unfazed by all of this. Consider the response of Sergey Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, to questions about sanctions which were posed to him whilst he attended the OSCE conference in Stockholm. And the question was, US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, has stated that if Russia took steps to destabilize Ukraine, sanctions would be applied against Moscow that have never been used before. Can you comment on this? Will Moscow respond to such sanctions? And Lavrov replied, regarding Nuland's statement, Antony Blinken and several other delegates, including Germans, issued similar warnings about sanctions unlike anything before. There's always a first time. There were other sanctions they refrained from taking in the past. Our Western colleagues have lost the culture of dialogue and diplomatic negotiations and the ability to look for consensus and a balance of interests. If something goes against their grain, they promptly impose sanctions, and not only against Russia. The West almost always threatens and imposes sanctions on countries that refuse to share its unequivocal approaches. I hope that this is not the deplorable proof that the West has lost the ability to negotiate, but only evidence that the Russophobic trend is preventing NATO and the EU from doing practical work, abandoning confrontation, and getting down to what the OSCE was established for. If new high-pressure sanctions, and the words high pressure in the Russian readout of Lavrov's words are in quotation marks, if new high-pressure sanctions are imposed on Russia, we will react to them. We will have to. How will we respond? Time will show. I would not like to guess what the West will do. They're threatening new financial and sectoral repressions. This is a path to nowhere, which will ultimately boomerang on the initiators of illegal unilateral measures. Now, before we discuss this further, before we look at the kind of sanctions the West has talked about, it might be considering, and what others have to say about these sanctions, let's just take a step back and think where we are with the sanctions. I've already touched on this before, but the West essentially initiated its sanctions war against Russia in 2013. The first sanctions which were imposed on Russia had absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine. They were imposed by the US Congress in 2013, and they related to the Magnitsky affair. They took the form of the Magnitsky Act, which allowed the United States, or caused the United States, to impose sanctions on Russia for human rights abuses. And then further rounds of sanctions began to be initiated in 2014, including the very important sectoral sanctions which were imposed on Russia, which restricted the access of Russian banks and financial institutions to funding from the West. And there were also sanctions on the Russian oil and gas industry, specifically sanctions intended to prevent Russia developing its oil and gas fields, and also sanctions which prevented the export by Western countries of dual-use technology which could notionally be used in the military technological field. Well, let's take a step back and think about those sectoral sanctions for a moment. There have been other sanctions, many other sanctions imposed by the United States, but none of them are anywhere close to being as important as the sectoral sanctions which were imposed by the United States and by the European Union on Russia in 2014, which have taken the form which I've just spoken about. Let's talk about the financial sanctions. Far and away the most important. In 2014, as I've discussed in previous programs, the Russian financial system was tightly integrated into the world financial system. It was, in effect, the Russian branch of the world financial system operating in Russia. And moreover, the world financial system and, in effect, the Russian financial system was to a very great degree controlled at that time and today by the United States. So I think there were widespread expectations in the United States and in Europe that those sanctions imposed on the Russian financial system in 2014 would be enough to cause the entire Russian economy to implode. Well, it didn't work out like that. Firstly, the Russian central bank, by 2014, had already hoarded up massive financial reserves. It had also taken steps to strengthen the Russian financial system, to start separating it, in effect, from the financial system of the West. And in 2014, the Russians took a step which the Western powers never anticipated the Russians would take, which is that they floated the ruble. They allowed the ruble to find its own level on the international markets, so that it was no longer no longer traded within a tightly controlled band which required regular market interventions by the Russian central bank, but at the same time causing Russian financial institutions to opt out of use of the dollar and to start using the ruble instead, because they could no longer convert rubles into dollars at a level which was comfortable for them, because the ruble was at this point floating. And that was a decisive step, and it has meant that ever since, Russia's financial services industry has essentially developed and evolved under its own, in its own direction, supported by the Russian central bank. It no longer depends or relies upon external financing, and in effect, it now functions independently of the world financial system. And there have been various other sanctions that people have been talking about the Russian financial system, but we'll come to those in a moment. Then let's look at the other sanctions which were imposed on Russia at that time. Sanctions restricting development of Russian oil and gas fields. Has that stopped or impeded or delayed Russian energy developments in any way? Not at all. The Russians have pressed ahead. They're developing their Arctic fields. They become a major player in the supply of liquefied natural gas. They have continued to forge ahead in their energy sector, but with an important difference from that which existed before 2014, which I will come to in a moment. And as for the third, the restrictions on the export to Russia of dual-use technology, well, has that affected the development of Russia's high-tech sector? Has it in any way affected the development of Russia's military industries? Not at all. On the contrary, those military industries, that high-tech sector, have moved into ever higher gear ever since then. Today, Russia not only builds microchips, it also builds sophisticated weapon systems of a level of sophistication that would have been unimaginable and was not imagined by the West in 2014. And of course, it's a leader in all various types of technologies, including nuclear power engineering, materials science, all sorts of things of that nature. I would add that another effect of the sanctions on dual-use technology is that it has encouraged the Russians to develop their own internet infrastructure, which now has evolved to the point where the Russian internet, the RUNET, is in effect in a position to function, even if Russia were completely disconnected from the World Wide Web. So none of these sanctions has achieved the objectives that people expected in the West that they would do. They might have had some effect initially on Russian economic growth rates, as the Russians had to take measures to mitigate and work their way round these sanctions. But as I've discussed on numerous occasions, their overall net effect has been to make the Russian economy stronger and more resilient. But what these sanctions are doing is that they're having an increasing effect on the West. Now, the Russians only imposed one counter-sanction on the West in response to the sectoral sanctions which were imposed upon them in 2014. They restricted imports of food and agricultural products from the EU into Russia. And this was done at a time when the Russian government was anxious to develop the agricultural side of Russia's economy. I remember many predictions in the West that this was a misguided and misconceived policy that would add to inflation in Russia, that it would mean that Russians would become disaffected as they were unable to buy Western cheeses and those kind of products. There were all sorts of articles to that effect in the West. Well, in fact, it's been a runaway success. It has had the effect of transforming Russia into a agricultural and food superpower, to the point where today Russia is the swing producer in terms of wheat exports. So Western food exporters to Russia clearly have suffered a loss. They have lost a major market. But it's much worse than that. And you can see how the problems are starting incrementally. If we are talking about the situation at the moment in terms of, say, industrial exports to Russia, the fact that the Russians no longer import dual-use technologies means that they are now either developing themselves, which, by the way, they are to a great extent, or they are importing them from other people, specifically from China, which has now become increasingly Russia's single biggest trade partner, single biggest national trade partner. And of course, it is Western industrial groups, Western manufacturers, primarily European ones, that as a result are losing out. It's now the case that, for example, German and Dutch machine tool exports to Russia having been restricted, the machine tool exporters who were increasingly looking to Russia as a major market for those machine tool exports now find that they're gradually being pushed out of this market, either by Russian manufacturers or by Chinese and Korean manufacturers against whom they can't realistically compete on a market where they are restricted in what they can sell. And in fact, this is the case in sector after sector. One particular sector where I take a great deal of interest for all kinds of historic reasons, which I'm not going to discuss on this program, is the aerospace industry. Before 2014, Russia, to all intents and purposes, imported all its civilian aerospace products. It imported imported jet engines. It imported civilian airliners from Boeing and Airbus. What this has done, what these events, these sanctions have done, is that they've acted as a massive spur to the Russians to develop their own aerospace industry. So we now have the Russian aerospace industry developing its own civilian high bypass turbofans, We have the PD-14 jet engine, which is now starting to enter use. We see much more powerful engines, the PD-35 and the PD-50 coming into use, approaching production, which will mean that the Russians have engine technology, high bypass turbofan engine technology that can match that of the West and which can be used on domestically produced aircraft. And we see how the Russian aircraft, like the Sukhoi Superjet, which was initially essentially a Russian frame stuffed with Western engines and Western technologies, is now being Russianized with Russian avionics, Russian electronics, and with new Russian-designed engines, the PD-8, which is a less powerful version of the PD-14. And we see how the Russians, together with the Chinese, are now busy developing long-haul, large civilian airliners powered by these Russian engines, and by the way, by Chinese engines, which the Chinese are also developing, probably with some collaboration from Russia. And these will provide the Russians and the Chinese with engines and aircraft covering the full range of civilian aerospace products in competition, in direct competition with the products produced by Boeing and Airbus and General Dynamics and Pratt & Whitney and Rolls-Royce and all those companies. Now, anybody who knows how important the aerospace industry is to the industrial exports of the West will know what an enormous potential challenge that is going to be. And I would add that it will also give the Russians, and by the way, the Chinese, a degree of resiliency which they haven't had in their industrial sectors up to now. I would add, by the way, that I have direct knowledge of this. One Russian city that I know quite well is the Russian city of Perm, and it is in fact in Perm that these Russian engines are being designed and built. So we can see that the Western sanctions are at one and the same time losing for Western industrial companies access to an important market, and they are creating for them long-range industrial competitors. Now, the Soviet Union in its day, of course, also built aerospace products, but they were, to put it mildly, unsuitable for export. The new products that the Chinese and the Russians are developing are directly analogous to the West and could be easily exported around the world. It's going to be an industrial challenge, the like of which the Western economies have not experienced up to now, with the Russians and the Chinese almost certainly being able to outperform the Western companies, the Western industrial companies, aerospace companies, in terms of cost, and with the Russians and the Chinese also probably able to outproduce what the West is producing. As I said, this is actually, in industrial and industrial export terms, a game changer. But it gets worse. I'm talking about aerospace products, but let's talk about energy. And energy is, of course, in some ways the most important issue of all, because it's becoming increasingly clear that the energy sanctions that were imposed on Russia in 2014 are already backfiring. Why in Europe today is there a natural gas shortage, a shortage of natural gas? Why in the West, why across the world are there problems with oil and energy prices? It's largely because the sanctions which were imposed on Russia in 2014 have redirected the Russian energy industries, the oil and gas industries, away from its historic markets in the West, in Europe and potentially in the United States, eastward towards China, potentially towards India, also to the other East Asian states, towards ultimately the Koreas and Japan. I can remember how on the brink of the sanctions war in 2014, Exxon, the great US oil company, was busy working with the Russians to develop great oil fields in the Arctic. BP was also at that time investing heavily in the Russian oil sector. And of course, in 2014, the Russians were only pondering at that time the prospect of building gas pipelines to China. In fact, the gas pipelines that the Russians eventually built to China, or are building to China, were announced in 2014 at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum by no less a person than Vladimir Putin himself. And I was physically present at that time in the conference hall when it happened. And I remember that there was a top member of the Chinese Politburo there, obviously pleased that things had turned out very much the way he wanted. And of course, that happened in 2014, directly in the aftermath of the initial stages of the Ukrainian crisis. So one could see how Western consumers, Western citizens are already paying for this sanctions war directly. Every single Western citizen, European citizen, and North American citizen who today is having to pay more for their gas, their heating fuel, and indeed, arguably, for the gas at the filling stations for their cars, is actually paying the price of the sanctions war that the West initiated against Russia way back in 2014. I'm going to go further. I'm going to say this. The sanctions are now indirectly levying a price on the West, which is far greater and doing far more damage to the Western economies than the sanctions war is doing to Russia. The sanctions on Russia disrupted Russia's GDP growth for a time. They led to a major inflation spike in 2015. But overall, the Russian economy has adjusted. By contrast, because of the sanctions, Western companies are losing out market share. They're seeing industrial competitors start to form in the East. And above all, Western consumers, residential and industrial, are literally running out of gas and or are facing much higher gas prices than they would otherwise do. Westerners are far more directly affected by the sanctions war than they realise, and Western economies are affected profoundly by it also. And now we come to the next sanctions, the sanctions which the United States and the Europeans are believed to be considering. And there's been a discussion about this by that indispensable person, Scott Ritter, who discusses the kind of sanctions, financial sanctions, that the Western powers appear to be thinking of imposing and upon the West, upon Russia, in the event that there is a war in Ukraine. And this is what Scott Ritter had to say about this. When a Secretary of State, he means Blinken, speaks of all contingencies, it is accepted as code for the possibility, even a probability of military action. Blinken quickly explained, however, that he was intimating no such thing. We've made it clear to the Kremlin that we will respond resolutely, including with a range of high-impact economic measures that we've refrained from using in the past, he said, leading to speculation that the United States was considering cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system of international transfers. But this has been proposed as a potential sanction since 2014 over Moscow's alleged role in the Donbass conflict. Since then, Russia has developed an alternative to SWIFT called SPFS, as well as its own card payment system, Mir. So, the Russians are already prepared for a disconnection from SWIFT. Who is going to suffer most if Russia is disconnected from SWIFT? Well, not the big industrial companies that are involved primarily in Russia's export trade. Gazprom and Rosneft are not going to be affected significantly. Western economies, Western customers are still going to pay for their gas and their oil to Gazprom and Rosneft in the traditional way that these large payments are paid for, not via transfers by SWIFT, but through promissory notes and things of that kind. The kind of people who are going to suffer are the middle level companies, Western companies that have invested in Russia. They're going to find it impossible to transfer money quickly out of Russia as they once could. Many of them will for many of them, at a time of gathering economic recession, this could very well turn out to be pretty much the last straw. So again, cutting off Russia from SWIFT is going to do more damage, it seems to me, to sway the Western business than it is going to do in the long term or even the very medium term to the Russian economy. Of course, if you go further, if you start meddling with Russian oil and gas exports, well, of course, at that point, your worldwide inflation problems, which are already pretty extreme, are going to take off in almost unimaginable ways. Cut Russian gas and oil exports off, and frankly, you're going to see oil not at $80 a barrel that it is now. US bankers already estimated that oil price could rise to $250 a barrel. Well, my opinion, it would go very much higher than that. I can't imagine how that can possibly benefit the West. I can't imagine how that can possibly benefit the United States. I can't help but believe that there must be people quietly advising the White House. Let's not go down these look to go down this route. Let's try and find some kind of off-ramp. We truly don't want to get ourselves into a position where we're imposing these sort of sanctions on the Russians, which could only make our own economic situations worse. If we're Germans, we surely want to see Nord Stream 2 brought into service. I gather, by the way, on that point, that there's been discussions about this between the Greens and their coalition partners in the new German government, and the Greens have quietly accepted that Nord Stream 2 must be brought into service in order to end the energy crisis that's now affecting Germany. So that, it seems to me, means that when people talk about sanctions and talk about these high energy sanctions, that actually gives the Western powers an incentive to avoid a conflict with Russia over Ukraine, which would only economically backfire disastrously on themselves. So, let's just recap. It would make no military sense to start a war in eastern Ukraine, which Ukraine would lose and which would end in a disaster for Ukraine and quite probably the breakup of the country. It would make no political sense for the Biden-Harris administration, who would be presiding over another epic debacle in Ukraine shortly after the debacle they've experienced in Afghanistan. And the economics, the sanctions, makes no sense at all. It is completely illogical. So, given that this is so, it makes obvious sense for Biden to agree to this suggestion, which I'm no doubt Putin will say to him. He will say, look, we're not intending to attack Ukraine. We can avoid a war in Ukraine. You won't have to impose any sanctions. All you have to do is to talk the Ukrainians out of doing it. And as I've said already, my impression is that behind all the strong words, all the language, that is exactly what is happening and what is being done. Now, how, however, did we get into this situation? What exactly is going on? Why have we had all this extraordinary belligerence, all this talk about wars, about Russian invasions, all these threats and all this talk? All that is managed is to create a sense of crisis between Russia and the West, which plays into the Russian agenda. Because what is now going to happen is that there's going to be a summit meeting between Putin and Biden, in which Putin is directly going to put to Biden Russia's red lines. He's going to be able to tell Biden any step to bring Ukraine or any other former Soviet republic, Moldova or Georgia, into NATO is for Russia a red line. And at that point, you have a war on your hands. Exactly what you say you urgently want to avoid, and which, for the reasons I've just discussed, make no real sense for you. And if that's the case, that's exactly the venue, that's exactly what the Russians would like to say. And of course, as we see, Putin's gone a step beyond that. He says, not only are these our red lines, but we are now insisting on a treaty, on firm legal and security guarantees that there will be no further eastward expansion of NATO. Something which the United States, NATO, has never wanted to discuss before. The Russians have now been able, as a result of this crisis, to put it directly and firmly on the international agenda. So how have we got into this situation, which is, as I said, playing into Russian hands? Well, I suspect that it's the usual push and pull within the administration itself, within the neocon hardliners who are incapable of accepting any kind of reverse gear and who are worried about the progressive disintegration of their Ukraine project, and the realists who lack the ability to restrain the hardliners, but who act always at the very last moment to try to calm things down. Regardless of what it is, this whole thing has been a disastrous debacle. And again, the person to put it best is Scott Ritter. And this is what he says. The real joke is on Blinken, Stoltenberg, and those responsible for formulating what passes as policy regarding NATO. To sum up the situation to date, American media accused Russia of planning an invasion, citing as evidence the existence of a garrison located 160 miles north of the border, and Kiev fell into line. The US and NATO expressed grave concerns over this build-up, noting that Russia could invade Ukraine in short order. The US then threatened that all options were on the table before clarifying that only economic sanctions would be considered. The head of NATO, after echoing US concerns over Russia's aggressive military posture, underscored the reality that because Ukraine was not a member of the alliance, the military bloc would not come to the defense of Ukraine should Russia invade. In short, NATO will not defend Ukraine from a Russian invasion that exists only in the imagination of Ukraine, the US and NATO. Lastly, the Russian Foreign Minister and the US Secretary of State met to discuss this crisis, agreeing to bump the matter up their respective chains of command. The result will be a phone conference between Presidents Biden and Putin, during which the issue of halting NATO expansion into Ukraine will be on the table as a possible solution to a crisis that was manufactured by the West to begin with. Speaking ahead on Friday of the planned talks, Biden stated that he would not accept Moscow's red line warning. Someday, international relations students will scratch their collective heads, wondering what, if anything, was going through the minds of those responsible for the current crisis. In any other circumstance, this sort of narrative would be fodder for dark comedy. However, the irrational fears and knee-jerk reactions involved are all too real, and as such represent a situation that Russia simply cannot ignore. So, we have a crisis spun out of thin air over Ukraine, a crisis which the Russians have exploited to put on the table in talks with the President of the United States, something which up to now has been a forbidden subject, a treaty which will prevent or prohibit further NATO eastward expansion. Obviously, Biden will not agree, certainly not at this summit. He would be political toast if he were ever to agree to that now. But the reality is that this is now on the table. It is now there for discussion, an item for discussion, and the Russians will not let it go. As I discussed in my previous program, the initiative, the diplomatic initiative, has passed to them, and the West doesn't know what to do. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me for this future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also, by the way, remember to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also join us on Locals, where we have a thriving community which publishes an increasing amount of exclusive content, where Alex and I also publish exclusive content, and where I now do regular live streams every Wednesday. If you want to interact with me directly, you can do so by becoming an active member and joining me on Locals for those live streams. You are fully welcome to do so. Also, you can find us on our various other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, SuperU, and the rest. And you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also, you can support us by coming to our shop, buying the amazing things that you will find there: our famous Duran magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Have a wonderful day and speak to you soon.